True subway horror stories make it sound like the subway is a hellscape, but what is it to you? Come along with me on this terrifying journey that will give you a truly memorable shiver down your spine. Story 1. The Subway Weirdo. This happened to me 4 to 5 years ago. I was around 25 then. I'm a female living in India. Basically, I was a student. One night, I was coming home from class, master classes, to be precise, which generally started at 6 p.m. and ended at 10 p.m. At about 11 p.m., I had to take the subway for about 12 stops. The destination I had to get off at was at the end of the line for the subway. At that time, there weren't many people on the subway. It was pretty late and the environs were calm. I'm lonely. I only need my headset and music and I'm good to go. After that, I plugged in my music and picked the furthest chair in the subway, away from the only 2 people who were taking the subway with me at that time. But out of nowhere, I saw with the corner of my eye a silhouette approaching me and sat right next to me. It was a man. He was pretty built, had dark hair, wearing dark glasses, a black hoodie, and a sickening smile. He didn't engage in talking with me but would stare at my phone as I would browse through my music. I could hear him breathing heavily, not painfully, but still, he felt something powerful. I couldn't help but ask myself these questions. Why was he so close to me? Why was he staring at my phone? And what does he want? Meanwhile, I felt uneasy, so I decided to change my seat and go even further behind, trying to avoid him without looking like a freak myself. I don't know to whom, but there was just another person with us the whole way. I guess that scared me even more. I picked a new chair, sat down, plucked my headset again, and proceeded with the remaining stops on my way home. I saw the silhouette growing bigger and bigger and a breeze running on my skin. As I realized the guy was again sitting right next to me, glancing in midair, dead eyes, a big smile, staring into my phone again. I panic. There were still 4 stops to go. I had nowhere to hide, and I looked at the other person in the subway trying to sit next to us, thinking that strength comes in numbers, but she was no longer there. Nevertheless, I started shaking a bit, not allowing the creeper to notice me being vulnerable. I stood up, went to the door, and just decided to stand until my stop came. This way, he wouldn't sit next to me, right? Oh, I was wrong. He came straight after me and sat on my chair right near the door, and because he couldn't see my phone, on which he was so focused so far from that angle, he fixates on me right in my soul with his black dead eyes and said, "Hi, gorgeous. Why are you avoiding me?" Now I was already freaking out as I looked at my phone, trying to call my boyfriend or message him, but it seemed to him that I was about to ask or seek help. He stopped me by saying, "I know no one will help you. You would have sent an SMS message by now, and I know you didn't." That moment, I realized I was cornered. He had been focusing on my phone to see who I was talking to and trying to figure out if I panicked, trying to see if I would ask someone for help. He cornered me badly. I had the luck to reach my stop, as I would delay any reaction or ignore him so that he would repeat whatever he wanted to say. I dropped off and ran for the exit, not looking back. I got out at the surface and didn't see him anymore. Eventually, I was happy. I thought I had escaped him, or probably he noticed I wasn't caught up in his chit-chat, and then he left me alone, or so I thought. At this moment, I put my phone in my purse and realized I had pepper spray with me all along. My heartbeat came back to normal as I knew I at least had something to defend myself with, but still, a long way to get. Home, and who knows if he is alone or not. Apparently that pepper spray had been my source of defense for a couple of years now. There was a time when a group of armed robbers attacked me. They needed my purse, which contained a certain amount of money, my personal documents, and other valuables. I just couldn't let them have it, so I had to fight and struggle for it. Thankfully, they weren't fully armed, just a couple of sharp objects and knives. All I had to do was to pretend and play along with them. I dipped my hand into my bag. Instead of bringing out the purse, I brought out my pepper spray. Immediately, I sprayed it on them, and I fled. That was how I saved myself that day. Now it was kind of occurring again, with this weird-looking man from the subway trailing me all the way. I walked relatively fast for maybe 6 minutes from the metro and felt a hand grab my wrist hard, pulling me back with another hand, covering my mouth, and disabling me from screaming my lungs out. Alas, it was him. The same black hoodie, dark eyes, and dead-eyes stalker. He was furious and said I was running away from him. How dare you run away from me? It would help if you were honored to receive my attention. Well, I'm pretty built for a woman, 80 kilograms and 1.75 meters tall. So I guess he thought men don't find me beautiful or something, and should feel blessed that a creep like him stalks me and tries to hurt me. Now my phone was in my bag. I couldn't call the police. I couldn't reach for the pepper spray either, and I panicked. I couldn't punch him in the crotch, and I couldn't scratch him in the face as I didn't have long nails. However, his hand was still on my mouth. What do? I did the most desperate and disgusting thing I could think of to save my life that day. I decided to play along with him. I used my other hand to touch the inside of his thigh and mumble, "I'm sorry," while his hand was on my mouth. Hearing that, he took his hand off my mouth, and I repeated that I was sad. I didn't realize he was flirting. Instantly, he left his guard down and took his hand off my wrist. It sounded like that word melted his heart and worked for him. He asked me for my phone number and address so that I could drop him off. But I refused, saying I'd rather add him on Facebook, and he agreed. I told him I'd reach for my phone so I could log in my details to add him quickly, but instead, I picked up the pepper spray and got him sprayed all over his face, making sure I'd cover both his eyes, nose, mouth, even his ears and hands. Luckily, he was instantly all red, suffocating from the pepper and swelling. He reacted quickly to it, maybe because his skin was susceptible to chemicals. At that point, while he was still struggling to free himself from irritation and pain, I called the police and told them what had happened and what I did. They asked me if he was immobilized, and I said yes, as the pepper effect wears off in 45 minutes. The police arrived there 5 minutes later to see me shaking like a leaf and the strange man on the ground, swollen like a pumpkin, throwing up and swearing at me between gasps of breath. Fortunately, he was arrested, and the police told me they had been looking for him for the past week, as they discovered the body of the 26-year-old woman in his apartment, a somewhat built lady, 1.8 meters tall and 70 kilograms with red hair. And I have red hair too. The woman was his girlfriend, and ever since he's never gotten back to the apartment. Now this is what he does. He goes around looking for younger ladies with light skin and red hair. After messing up with them, he would chain them up so he could see them daily, just like automatically making them his personal property. Naturally, he was obsessed with fair ladies and red hair. Honestly, I didn't know what he wanted to do with me. I could understand why he targeted me due to the similarities. With a stranger like this in the subway, stalking women at midnight, trying to befriend them, or even worse, I hope to God he'd never get out of jail. Right now, I still feel terrified going home from my late-night classes. I wish there were something I could do, but I concluded that getting more pepper spray for now was my only option. Before we move to the next one, please click that subscribe button to Top Scares, where we bring you intriguing stories that will scare and blow your minds. You can like, share, and comment on this video. Let us know what you think. Story 2. The Giant Black Figure Painting. Here in New York City, I was an enthusiastic urbex fan growing up. There are some fantastic views here, as you can expect, but oddly, more than half of the community believes that one of the urbex holy grails is over in Cincinnati. Conversely, Cincinnati is well known for its original baseball team, or that strange Greek Chile. It's famous among urbexers for one thing, the Cincinnati subway. For those unaware, the subway was supposed to replace Cincinnati's streetcar system. Work on the project began at the close of World War I, but it was abandoned when the Great Depression struck. The most extensive abandoned subway system in the US, cracking the place is like an urbex rite of passage, giving you endless bragging rights, having explored a maze of underground tunnels larger than some towns. What's left is just over 2 miles of abandoned tunnels and stations. Nevertheless, given all the fantastic tales we hear about the underground, I assumed my trip there would be a dream come true. It was something I would never be able to explain fully, but it turned out to be one of the most horrifying and perplexing events of my life. My team and I had planned it for months, and I don't believe I've ever been so thrilled about anything. As I mentioned before, getting the 4 of us to southwestern Ohio required a good deal of planning. We were forced to drive my friend's gaudy 1990 Chevy Lumina, which was in such a horrible state that it had become a meme in and of itself. in addition to barely having enough money for gas. Including a potty stop, the drive to Cincinnati took about 12 hours, so even after we left, 9 a.m., which was the earliest we could get everyone together, by the time we got there, it was already after midnight. After a quick conversation, we agreed to get a few hours of sleep before descending into the subway because we were exhausted, hungry, and not in the mood to go below straight immediately. This proved to be a bad plan, as we hardly slept at all. After a few hours, we just decided to head to the 24/7 McDonald's for breakfast and take the train while the darkness still provided shelter. In the meantime, the tunnel entrance, at least the one we used, turned out to be very visible. It was just sitting there, obvious as day, on the side of a highway, and despite the sizable gray iron doors being very hefty, they turned out to be unlocked, and we were in. When one of us turned on their flashlight, I was momentarily taken aback. There was not a single tag or piece of graffiti art on the entire entrance's concrete walls. Discovering what appears to be a hidden gallery is one of the more enjoyable aspects of urbex on occasion. Finding an area devoid of art where I most expected it was a little disappointing. It was strange, but it didn't raise any red flags. Regardless, we eagerly began our ascent through the entry tunnel and discovered it split into two parallel twin tunnels. We walked for a few minutes before the tunnels emerged into our first deserted station. Imagine what this would have looked like: broad platforms with staircases that led nowhere and support columns. We discovered our first piece of street art there, which was fantastic. However, rather than being something to admire, I seem to recall finding it really scary. A massive black figure, its head and shoulders spilling over into the ceiling, had been sprayed all the way down one wall. The way it was framed gave the impression that it was looking down at you, which added to the piece's intelligence and unsettling quality. The logistics were really astounding as well. The walls had to be at least 15 feet high at the platform level, which meant that at some point, someone had to carry a ladder down there with him in order to spray that faceless object on the wall. Once the prominent, shadowy figure had sufficiently alarmed us, we continued down the rail tunnels, stopping at each station along the way. There were smaller tunnels branching off from each one. While some looked to go off into the distance, others were merely a few dead ends. However, there were a ton of other passages heading off from the last station we reached, or at least the one I went to. Since everything would have to fit within the tunnel, I'm assuming that we had reached the middle of the subway system by then, because I read that they intended to excavate the central terminal station first, and I assume we were in that terminal station since there appeared to be a tunnel hallway or corridor at each compass point. Even with the eerie street art, we're starting to feel relatively at ease by then. If you enter an ancient, abandoned building, the first 15 to 20 minutes can be really exhilarating. If there are any risks, your heart will continue to race for the most part of that time. By then, our count was in the upper 50s, and I even claimed we were somewhat seasoned. But in addition to making you messy, that experience also gives comfort. We also had a poor night's sleep and a sugar crash after overindulging beneath the golden arches. It wasn't a literal life or death rule, but in my experience, splitting up when exploring an abandoned structure was a surefire way to end things. It would help if you didn't venture off on your own unless you're really sure of your surroundings, though you can go into a nearby room and disappear from view for a brief while. You've probably heard terrifying tales of gas sinks where a person enters a room, passes out, and then dies soundlessly. Their companions then trailed them into the room one by one, only to die with them. Small things like that are fantastic warning signs, but gas sinks are uncommon and occur only very deep down. I just turned off for a bit of a while and ventured into a passageway by myself, ignoring the possibility of danger. I recall feeling confused when I turned around and walked back down the corridor to see that it didn't open out into the abandoned station. I know it was stupid, but I swear I didn't wander too far. I took a deep breath, collected my thoughts, and paused for a moment, feeling this fleeting sense of confusion wash over me. It made sense that my crew would be at the end of the passageway I was observing. However, there was still no station when I descended, and I had to keep using my flashlight to see in the darkness. I'll confess that I became a little anxious. I call out down the hallway, hoping that my buddies can hear me, and my voice echoes. I immediately entered denial, just like anyone else may have done when they failed to answer. I mockingly cried out, "Very funny, guys, come out now," but nobody answered. Then, in that fleeting moment of dread, I tried to stop myself from going down another corridor, but I was powerless. It was absurd. I knew how to follow my own path. I'd done it 1,000 times before. Yet here I was, with 50 or so mistakes under my belt, and I had truly wandered off and become lost. I attributed it to my fatigue and the dimness of the subway before reaching into my backpack to get my walkie-talkie. We always carry these compact yet potent radios with us just in case. Although we hadn't used them previously, everything has its initial use. I took out the radio, turned it on, and started speaking on channel 1 as agreed upon. We had a tiny prearranged rule that said everyone was supposed to pull out their radios for simple communication as soon as they got separated. The guys had to have got their radios out by then, or at least one of them must have guessed I was missing. However, I returned to believing that they were merely pulling a practical joke on me when I spoke on the channel and received no response. My radio abruptly came to life with an incoming broadcast. It sounded a little distorted, but considering that large blocks of concrete surrounded us, I wasn't surprised. However, as I tried to make out sounds above the static, I discovered that the voices were not those of my friend. It sounded, in fact, a lot more feminine. I could only make out the first 4 or 5 words. The rest were totally messy, even though there was a faint feminine accent. However, when I focused and strained my hearing, I heard the voice saying something that sounded a lot like, "Help me." It was the first time I had ever experienced a full-blown panic attack in an abandoned building, and I had to try to calm myself and regulate my breathing consciously. In the meantime, I reminded myself that the assistance I believed I had heard might have come from nearly any 2-syllable word, and that the subway was a finite space, so even if I had managed to become lost, I couldn't stay lost if I kept going. That's just what I did then. I turned on my tiny headlamp, reassured myself that everything would be all right, and simply strolled off into the night. My primary objective was to locate the station where we had been standing so that I could leave the subway system by retracing my steps. However, in the 20 to 25 minutes that I spent walking, I could not still look for abandoned stations or even the twin railway tunnels that we had used to enter the area. It was only corridor after corridor, some branching off into 2 or 3 different passageways, and I never appeared to be able to get anywhere, no matter which path I chose. Since I could cover a mile on foot in about 15 minutes, it would take me 30 to 40 minutes to walk the whole length of the subway system. It made no sense. So when I realized that I had been walking for 45 minutes and still hadn't discovered a way out, I started to feel that panicky feeling building in my chest once more. I've been talking to my radio the entire time, hoping to get through to my friends, but they had to be within range. The only plausible explanation for why those radios were among our most expensive possessions is that the concrete was too dense for the radio waves to pass through. However, even with such a semblance of a scientific explanation, one clear idea kept coming to mind. Something was seriously wrong. Being a relatively sane person, I chose to believe the first theory, thinking that there was either something wrong with the tunnels or something wrong with me. I remember having to turn around when I initially came to a dead end, but after moving on for a few hundred feet, I found that the corridor pattern had changed. I first noticed them on the ceiling as well, these 3-dimensional rectangles that appear to have been chiseled out of the rock. Some of them had these cuboid concrete bumps in them, as though they were the bases for some barrier. My suspicions were verified when I realized that the concrete in front of me was completely wet, which wasn't the situation only moments before. At least I hadn't noticed those things traveling down the corridor the first time. It both bothered me more than losing my friends, that small thing. As you can easily imagine, water leaks and underground tunnels are a dangerous mix, and the discovery raised the stakes in the scenario. As soon as I saw the water, I picked up a lot more speed and tried not to panic, but the farther I went, the more challenging it was. I hoped that the sound of my dripping feet wasn't coming from the leak's source, and that I wouldn't be struck by an underground tsunami or anything like that. I know this wasn't the most sensible fear, but I was having trouble staying composed, as I said. The suspense was building at that point, and I thought I heard wet footsteps coming from behind me in the tunnel. I froze in place and listened, but the sound didn't persist, so I assumed it was just my own footsteps being echoed. However, not long after I started moving forward, I heard a footstep behind me that was clearly out of time with mine. Once more I came to a stop, but this time I immediately swung around and shone my spotlight into the shadows. The sound of footfalls stopped, and I didn't see anything, but I had the terrible impression that there was something there that escaped the beam of my flashlight. That prompted all of these questions, such as, who was down here without a flashlight, and who might have followed me and not announced themselves? I found myself in this strange situation, where I genuinely wished it was a cop who was following me and not someone else. The Cincinnati Police Department had a reputation for patrolling the tunnels and kicking out any homeless people trying to sleep there. Additionally, the urbex culture has a tendency to despise police officers and security guards. I made an effort to keep moving forward, but I started to slow down as I kept turning around, thinking I had heard footsteps. Subsequently, I encountered further barriers, the identical concrete cubes I had observed, but much more significant. In fact, some required me to step directly onto them to pass. They were simply there to help with tunnel construction, which was another reason it didn't make sense why they were there. A few hundred yards further on, my flashlight beam caught sight of something that made my stomach turn into knots. For no apparent reason, the tunnel suddenly became so much smaller that all I had to do to continue was squeeze myself through a tiny vertical opening that was only a few feet wide. For a moment, I stood there and exclaimed, "You have to be kidding me." My only other concern was that the opening would close even more, and I would become trapped while attempting to pass. However, as I was considering that idea, I heard footsteps behind me. This time, though, it was apparent what those footsteps were. I knew there was someone else in the tunnel with me, such that it couldn't have been my own echo. Wishful thinking, perhaps, I cried out to them, and when the footsteps suddenly picked up speed, I realized they had evil intents for me. Still, the choice was fight or flight, and I opted for the latter at that very moment, thrusting myself shoulder first into the tiny concrete opening and then grinding my way through. I was expecting to feel a hand grab at my back the entire time, so when I eventually came out on the other side, I whirled to display my flashlight to see who the hell was after me, but nobody was there. But I knew they were out there, lurking slightly to one side, perhaps simply waiting for me to down my guard so they might follow me through. Naturally, I didn't wait to see if I was correct. Instead, I just started running over the wet concrete, attempting to get as far away from my pursuers as possible. I noticed more of those strange cuboid structures as I ran, but this time they were triangular in shape, resembling little pyramids protruding from the walls, the floor, and the ceiling. These new items seemed almost utterly random, like a glitch in a video game level or something. But the others had at least appeared to have a purpose. I would have taken more time to watch them if I hadn't been frantically trying to save my life. The tunnel narrowed down again after a few hundred yards or so. That time, it was unlike anything I had ever seen. Looking back, it reminded me of a work of tessellated art. In this kind, a single shape is rendered in various proportions to produce a sort of three-dimensional optical illusion. If I hadn't had to crawl through it on my stomach, not knowing if I would become stuck and starve to death, it would have been intriguing. The path was tiny, requiring me to remove my backpack and thrust it before me to squeeze through. It was lined with little replicas of the same pyramid constructions. The tiny ridges ripped over my back the entire time, yet even though my adrenaline was rushing so quickly I could feel the pain. I could feel the tiny ridges against my neck, shoulders, and skull at that point when I was unable to move forward anymore. I was genuinely stuck since I could not push my backpack any farther. I'm not ashamed to admit that I felt a strong impulse to cry because I was so terrified and unwell. It seems that my mother, who had constantly warned me that if I continued with the trespassing crap, I would eventually hurt myself, had been validated. The only thing that stopped me from crying was the possibility that she might never realize how correct she was. I knew I couldn't find it if I looked for where I was, thus I'd never be found. Actually, I realize that may sound absurd, But when I was confined to the strange, finely detailed crawl space at that precise moment, it made perfect sense. And just as I realized how completely screwed up I was, I heard movement through the tunnels behind me. I'm not sure how this actually happened because, despite my best efforts, I was unable to go through the crawl space. However, when I heard that person and what I assumed to be someone approaching from behind, my adrenaline went through the roof. I was barely aware that I had pushed my backpack out the other side because I was so busy kicking my legs, wriggling my torso, and shoving my rucksack in front of me. I then exhaled deeply to force myself to fit through the aperture and pull as hard as I could once I had a handle on it. The second time that night, I was on the verge of tears when I felt myself released from the concrete grasp of the crawl space. However, I had to keep on. There was no time for celebration. My flashlight only started to flicker just when I needed it most, just when I thought I was going to go insane from dread. That evening, I changed the batteries so I could go explore the underground. Panic overcame me, and I rushed down the hallway, trying to go as far as possible before the flashlight ultimately died. There was no way I could have stayed down there long enough to drain them. In essence, it began to flash once more while I was running. I even started yelling out to my mother as though she might somehow save me from an awful fate. Then I stumbled and fell hard on the ground. In addition to sweating and feeling the sting of my forearm grazes, I also noticed a doll-like ringing in my ear, which I initially assumed was a result of being knocked out. However, the constant ringing wasn't coming from my mind. Instead, it was coming from a nearby roadway, and as I opened my eyes, I realized I was back outside. I stumbled in the dark, and I have no idea how I made my way back outdoors. I looked about for the opening I'd fallen out of, but I couldn't see anything until I stopped, ugly crying into the soil. My phone started vibrating in my pocket as it reconnected to the cell network right as I was gathering my thoughts on what actually had occurred to me. Unexpectedly, as I extended my hand to grab the phone, I noticed my friends a short distance away. I couldn't have imagined the looks on my friends' faces as I tried to explain what had transpired on the journey back. They discouraged me from ever attempting to adequately describe it to someone else. Perhaps they believed me to be crazy or something. A psychiatrist diagnosed me with a stress-induced psychotic break, and I spent a few years in therapy. I made an effort to believe that what had transpired was all in my imagination, but in all honesty, I know that's not really the case. I can't help but think of that enormous black image that someone had spray-painted on the wall whenever I remember that evening. I don't think I understood at the time why someone would spend so much time on something that no one would ever see. My entire line of thinking was altered after witnessing that figure. Story 3. A bizarre camping experience near a subway. I frequently go camping, and I live in Milan. I'm basically at the point of wrinkles. I usually do a ton of research on the places I intend to camp, including any unidentified bones that have been discovered in accidents or missing people in the region. I adore macabre stuff like that. I wanted to check out Castlegate Cemetery and my great-grandfather's ghost town, which is thankfully now entirely on private land, before I headed down from Black Woods. Let me briefly explain the winter quarters, the Castlegate, and mining disasters in case you are unfamiliar. The bodies of 171 men who perished on March 8, 1924, after a succession of mine explosions, are interred in the Castlegate Cemetery. It was a pretty tiny town, and nearly all of the males of working age passed away on that particular day, leaving almost every lady in the community a widow. It was just incredibly unsettling to see the exact date of death on every burial monument. I have to admit that the sight was awful. The grave monuments only had a white cross with the date March 8, 1924, written on them. The remains, but for a few pieces of clothes, were unidentifiable. Alright, let us continue with my story. I had to travel a picturesque path to get to my final camping spot, which was close to Vernal. I began driving the road more frequently on numerous visits to the Vernal area since I genuinely enjoyed it. My fiancée Blessed and I have recently discovered some lovely-looking camping areas along the route. We chose to camp there last month as it was fantastic, lovely, and simple for our SUV to get to. This location was perfect for me because I want to camp as far away from people as possible yet still be close to my car, other than the fact that we were camping in the Ashley National Forest. which is strange because I always assumed the Ashley Forest was closer to Flaming Gorge because it was so large. I hadn't spotted any signage. On the other hand, Blessed and I decided to spend Father's Day weekend camping with our 14-year-old son, whom we nicknamed Dre. Dre had never gone camping before, and I had a terrible time falling asleep the night before we were scheduled to depart. My anxiety medication did not stop this unusually prolonged anxiety episode. I couldn't get rid of the sensation that if we went, bad things would happen to us. I sobbed and trembled all morning, questioning whether my gut sensation was natural or if my mental condition was making me act abnormally. Evidently, I talked about my worries because Blessed gets anxious too, and he really understands when my mental health issues get bad. Our child was determined to go, and I didn't want to spoil Father's Day for them. After a while, I settled down, and after approximately 2.5 hours of driving, we reached our destination. The area is home to many free-range cows, and many of them were near our campsite. It was amazing that there were no people around. They stayed away from us, so we left them alone. But we were prepared to hop in the car if they approached too closely, or a bull appeared. Apart from the cow pies and the constant lowing of cattle, the weather was ideal. There weren't many mosquitoes, and I couldn't have hoped for anything finer. My fear was just that, anxiety, and nothing more, or so I believed. While I set up the tent and inflated the air beds, the boys concentrated on building the fire pit and gathering wood. Together, we set out to construct the camp. While we slept in the tent, Dre would be safe and comfortable sleeping in the car on a twin-sized air mattress. When it was all said and done, the location was very significant because we had a good number of equipment. For added convenience, we installed a solar-powered light string for nighttime use. At this point, a vast bull appeared, allowing us to carry out our emergency plan, which included getting in the car just in case. He herded the cows out of our area. Having them gone as the sun lowered was good. The only thing left to do was prepare dinner, so I got to work on it as Dre curled up on his mattress in the back of the van with a blanket around him. He had been expressing his want to nap and was tired. Still, Blessed and I felt really uneasy as we went outside to collect more wood, even if we didn't talk about it at the time. We just felt like we were being watched as if something was hiding behind all the bushes around us, so we didn't want to leave the campsite or part ways. A voice popped out in my head. "What are you expecting? There was a reason it was named Black Woods." But we made it back to the campsite in less than 7 minutes, at which point I blamed it on a rogue cow, or possibly some deer. Dre got up and wanted to explore during sunset, which was rather lovely based on what we could see in the clouds. It was typical for a child to want to wander about and investigate, and I completely understand that. His father asked him, "Where are you going?" "Places," Dre replied, as he turned to leave. Then, as if he was curious to see what was inside, he turned around and headed for the tent. After half an hour, he reported that he had seen several eyes reflecting in the trees behind us, and that he would investigate. I simply chuckled and responded, "Nope," adding that supper would be served in about 20 minutes. I figured, what the heck, maybe he had seen another cow or deer. When I took food off the grill, he and his father were on the other side of the vehicle. I got up to finally inform them it was time to start our delicious tinfoil meal, which consisted of chicken, potatoes, broccoli, carrots, shallots, and garlic. Not to brag, but I can cook a delicious dinner over a campfire. The darkness was such that only truly isolated locations might experience it before the moon rose. We were, therefore, making extensive use of our flashlights. Using my flashlight, I quickly looked about and noticed that a few feet above the ground, directly in front of me, a stone's throw away, a pair of eyes were staring back at me. They could not have been the eyes of a cow, deer, elk, bear, or mountain lion because they were not animal eyes. They were so close together that they could hardly be seen reflected. They were entirely human in appearance, and someone was staring at us in the middle of the wilderness. They arrived silently and without using any lights. Every hair on my body stood on end, and my stomach dropped. I wasn't sure what I was genuinely seeing, so I shouted out and said something like, "Baby, come look at this." My flashlight left the eyes as I turned to check for my fiancée partially. But when I quickly whipped it back over, the eyes were still there, staring at me. That's when I realized it was real. After that, most animals would have run away, and a cow would have let out noises to indicate it was approaching. I froze. My eyes made every effort to detect any darkness. When Blessed turned to see why he had been called, the creature suddenly stood up, its eyes rising to a height of nearly 10 feet, while it continued to stare at me. And that's it. A human is frightening enough, but an 11 or 10-foot tall humanoid beast moving at that speed is just terrifying. My voice was trembling as I cried, "Get in the car," and I backed up. For the first time in his life, my handsome and faithful kid jumped in the car without asking any questions. I put myself in the rear with him, and Blessed climbed into the passenger seat, claiming that I had stacked some luggage in the driver's seat. I know, stupid. I was shivering visibly as I gave a rapid description of what I witnessed. I'm not the most demanding girl around, but I've been through a lot, so I definitely shouldn't have survived. I've gone camping and hiking by myself, and I've never been afraid. I may have shivered a little when I saw eyes reflecting off of eels and stonefish within a foot or two of me during night snorkeling, but that was nothing compared to sheer dread as those eyes rapidly rose. After hurriedly moving the suitcases, Blessed got into the driver's seat, turned on the high beams, and started the vehicle. Even though we were blind, we knew we had to get out. Upon approaching the tent with the car, we took out our machetes and instructed Dre to remain inside the vehicle at all costs. Thankfully, we had several gallon bottles of water close by, so I used them to douse the fire as Blessed covered me, and I took the bags containing our clothes out of the tent. We left the tent cooler, and the food still steamed on the grill and flew away like banshees. It was a terrifying drive down the dark canyon. "What color were the eyes that you saw?" Dre inquired after we had all been silent for a while, attempting to make sense of what was happening. In response, I said that they were a pale blue-green color. I asked him how far apart the eyes looked, and he replied, "That's what I noticed too." According to him, they were as near together as a person's eyes would be. I've now learned that red light reflects from human eyes. Therefore, it couldn't have been a person. Moreover, I only know a few people who are 10 feet tall. We pulled over at a well-lit gas station when we reached the closest town and made a nighttime hotel reservation. We were already uneasy when we saw a car was following us closely on the way there. Blessed reduced our speed slightly in case they intended to pass us, and we noticed that the red and blue lights were blinding us as we looked into the mirrors. We were traveling 10 miles below the speed limit when he stopped us, the police informed us. We told him the truth when he inquired about our origins and destination. Even though we weren't drunk and didn't have anything illegal on us, we realized it sounded wild, but I still had the machete next to me. Fortunately, it went unnoticed, and he appeared captivated by the narrative. He stated, "I've heard many stories about weird stuff happening up here, so it doesn't really surprise me." He said, "Thank you, officer," and waved us off. "Have a wonderful evening." Nothing had been touched when we came back in the morning to recover our belongings. Nothing was nibbled on or disturbed when it came to the food that was left out, including the bread, chicken, and rubbish bag. I decided to look into our campsite's location in greater detail later that evening. When I eventually discovered the name of the actual canyon, Indian Canyon, it was a hotspot for Bigfoot sightings and paranormal activity. There's a subway not too far away. Dre believes we overreacted and it wasn't a huge concern, which is okay. Apart from being denied the opportunity to make s'mores, he seemed completely fine. Perhaps it was nothing, or maybe it was, and I don't want him to have nightmares about it or anything. However, we agreed to take him camping again, so I'm not taking a chance. Thus, he is welcome to have his s'mores, but we won't return to Indian Canyon. Now, what do you think about these stories? Drop your comment down below. Check out our previous video.